So hello, Carl Barnes. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I'm Cesar John Harder, and there's also Jody Loy, who is going to join through the drawings. So in a nutshell, like how would you describe your different roles? How many hats do you wear nowadays?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm wearing a few. So my title is product manager at Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropy that focuses on science and technology. Um, in that role, I've touched a lot of different areas, but I particularly have focused on climate and climate data. And so I've helped out different teams that are working on kind of novel ways of using and approaching climate data. Um, some more specifically for climate science, some more in the world of kind of geospatial remote sensing applications of tools, that type of thing. Um, but my hat is mostly as a kind of like combination of like engineer, designer, strategist, etc., to help build out different initiatives that are seeking to make climate data better, basically.
That's awesome. May I ask you, what is your background and how did you get to have this like triple hat of engineer, designer, and strategist? Like, did you study those three things, or did you learn it on the job? Like, how?
Yeah, it's a good question. I kind of slipped my way into it. This is my form of getting involved in climate science without being a climate scientist myself, or having a degree in climate science or, oceanography or anything like that. I studied human-computer interaction in college, which I think already brought me into an interdisciplinary approach to technical problems. And from there, I kind of just like cultivated more skills in design, as well as in engineering, and kind of have brought those together within the philanthropy. Because I think being in a philanthropy is also a unique position because we fund many different projects on different kind of types of impact. And so through that, I've been able to kind of get a more of an overview of things that are happening within the space.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry.
Mhm.
So of these different work that you do, I think there's one that you didn't mention is representable. Is that something you do under Schmidt, or this is an additional activity that you do?
Yeah. This is something I did before I took this job, and I'm still connected with, but I'm just not like full-time running it, Representable is a community mapping platform to fight gerrymandering, which I realize that gerrymandering is a pretty American thing.
Yeah.
It's basically just that when politicians redraw district lines in order to favor their party or their political party, and it's a pretty big flaw in the design of democracy. So representable is meant to be one piece of kind of fixing the bug in democracy of gerrymandering, by being an easy to use tool for communities to draw maps for representation in the democratic process. Um, so it was really something I worked on a lot in after the 2020 census in America and grew it out that way. So in that form, I guess my kind of arc of work has been this human-computer interaction focus, moving into the democracy space, but through that kind of getting an understanding of mapping and large data sets and things of that sort, which
Mm.
then allowed me to transfer those skills over to more climate-focused areas. And
Right.
also anything that impacts democracy and how people are represented and stuff like that is also frequently a climate issue in some way, either directly or indirectly. Um, so I think making those connections feels really important. And I think those connections can be made through technical approaches, not just through,
Awesome.
I don't know, talking about it or something like that.
Yeah. So there's a lot happening right now in America, and you are there, and we are not. We are based in Asia. Can you give us a hot take of what's happening and how maybe before we go into the organization, like how personally do you feel about what's happening? If that's okay to ask, you don't have to if you don't feel comfortable.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, it's kind of scary. It's a scary time right now. I think I mean, personally, I'm like, yeah, quite scared for a lot of my neighbors, and the people who like live in my communities. There's a lot of migrants in New York City where I live, who are at risk from raids from immigration and yeah, border enforcement. And it feels like I've kind of all-out attack is just starting on the structures that undergird a lot of how things happen here. A lot of cutting of like fundamentals. That means that we're going to start seeing things start to collapse and fall apart in strange ways. Um, and it's going to require a lot of coming together and action laterally across different areas of work in order to plug in those gaps. So, for instance, in the world of climate, I think there's definitely this feeling of like, okay, like we've got 4 years of an uphill battle against more fossil fuel extraction and uh, just attacks on science, like decreases in funding and stuff like that. But hopefully that can also be an opportunity to rethink some of the ways that we fund and do our science, to really shore up the areas that are being defunded and being attacked, and use that as a springboard to keep the work going despite the attacks on it. So that's like the hopeful angle. I think the other angle is just that like we've got to work. Like we got a lot of work to do.
And so, because the moment is so much of the essence, where do you feel that the energy should be put? Do you feel that it should be done into like resisting, into inventing new system, into going out of America instead of looking, like, well, where do you think are the most strategic places to put your effort? Then we can transition into the things that you do.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Um, I think it's a great opportunity to really shift focus a little bit more towards the global south. Um, of course, a lot of things that are happening in America and funded by American dollars or something like that are meant to be focused on the climate of the US, for instance. But I think that across the world, the largest gaps that we see in consistent climate data are in the global south. And that's because there's not an infrastructure there, there's not incentives to collect that data or to share that data. And there's not a like network of trust. And those are areas that one are going to be the most hit by climate change, are already the most hit by climate change and most impacted, and also have the kind of like core areas where we can improve the way that climate modeling is done, for instance, and understand on a global level through that data. Um, it's a lot easier to make those leaps and bounds in improvement in places where the data is not exactly there already, and that is in places that we also like are not generally looking. So some of the work that I've done is that we fund projects that are focused on like the Southern Ocean, which is, an area that has not much research into the carbon mixing that's happening there, or permafrost in Siberia. Like, what's happening there? Like, how much do we have to worry about them coming, giving off like, a carbon rather than absorbing carbon every year? Yeah, these are all areas that I think we should have more focus on. So it's a good opportunity to be like, actually, let's like plug in the gaps that we already see.
You use a word that I've never heard before, and that's super, super interesting. You just mentioned networks of trust. And so because you're talking about going exploring new places, do you have to rely on existing networks of trust, or do you build those? And what is a network of trust, and how do you build it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a network of trust often exists in some way or form. I think there's a classic problem that goes back to the colonial origins of science, of scientists coming into a location, a place, and then extracting and then leaving and expecting that they can just leave and there's no repercussions or something like that. Um, and so networks of trust, I think, is about kind of understanding that there are a lot of people who are connected to this different data or in whatever form that it takes, who are stewards of the land, or who might not have technical qualifications, but are still very much people who are attuned to the ecosystem or something of that sort. Um, and so the connection between this kind of like high level planetary view, which is very like constructed. And I mean that in like a literal way of that it is like constructed by many scientists across the world, at different like modeling centers and stuff like that. Um, that can and should be connected with the more like local understanding of what is going on in an ecosystem. And through that, a lot of it's money, honestly. I think networks of trust arise because there's already an inequality or an inequity across the different ways that people are coming to a situation. And so if you're a team of, global north based climate scientists going to West Africa to like try and acquire some climate data, like you have to recognize that you are coming in with a position of like so much more privilege than the other people there. And that as someone representing an institution or something like that, hopefully you have the ability to funnel some of that like money and resourcing to those people who are there, in order to make it most equitable of a situation, I think.
This is very powerful. Do you have examples? Maybe because you have to look at so many projects, and because you're on the side of the funders with the Schmidt Foundation, do you have examples? I would love to hear that actually are managing to reduce reduce inequality, sorry, through like better climate science. Like, do you have example of such things happening?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think one example that comes to mind for me right away is something that's uh, been a pretty cool project that we've supported for a little while. It's called Mati Carbon. And MATI is an initiative that's doing enhanced rock weathering for CO2 removal. So they're addressing the question of like how are we drawing down carbon dioxide? But I think sometimes when you get lost into a world of uh, direct air capture and things of that sort, then it becomes, yeah, there it is, MATI carbon. Um, you're kind of talking about things in an abstract way, but Mati is really rooted in farmers in India. So uh, the founder of Mati, Shantanu, has a relationship with a lot of different local rural communities in India, and it's kind of like you can trace through who knows who and that type of thing. But at its root, it's about meeting people where they're at and enabling them to get some funding, some money for doing this action that will actually help their farming in the first place, um, as well as offer them the chance to make money off of their use of enhanced rock weathering. So I think that that's a pretty good approach, especially because, yeah, it's focused on small farmers, who I think are the folks who are really vulnerable to climate change because they can't absorb shocks nearly as much as larger conglomerates can.
That is amazing. Do you feel that so that's an example that is the successful in the sense that it's also serving the people on the ground? Do you imagine that it could be what is the future? What is your dream? Like how could we even go like even further? Like what would be the dream application that somebody sends you and you're just like, yes, this is like ticking all the boxes and more. Like what do you think would be like
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the dream is, I think, for this and many other projects is to like scale responsibly, um, which I say because I think scaling is the challenge, right? Like I think with something like Mati, it's like a wonderful project, but if you're enforcing a uniform approach, um, it might not scale responsibly because it's not meeting people at where they're at and their flexibility for things. Um, so I think the dream is to be able to offer people, particularly working people, indigenous people who are stewards of land, a kind of suite of options with which they can continue the existing work that they're doing, whether it's feeding their families or taking care of a river or something like that. Um, and at the same time, they can uh, be meeting climate goals. I think having this approach that climate action means completely revolutionizing your way of life should not be applied mostly just for the people who are working people in the global south or something like that. So I think that, yeah, the dream is scaling responsibly, I think.
now that the government is changing its relationship to the climate science, what does it change for? I mean, I don't know if you can speak on the behalf of the whole organization, but within your department, or do you think that is it changing anything for you guys?
Mhm. Yeah, I think so. I think it means there's even more kind of leaning on privately funded science or philanthropically funded science, which I think systemically is not a good sign. I'll say that for sure. I think that we always want philanthropically funded science to be augmenting the existing work that's being done. And I think that's particularly important because philanthropy is kind of an opportunity to do something that's maybe a little riskier or on a bigger scale or something like that, a scale of coordination too across different continents or places or institutions um, that might not otherwise get funded.
Mhm,
So I think that there's more attention to like, oh wow, like this is a really important way that we continue to get the work done. And
mhm,
then I think that also means that there's more of a need for communication across the work that's being done. I think one of the big questions for some of the climate science funding that's happening at Schmidt is that we're trying to tackle huge issues. Like one of our goals is to reduce uncertainty in understandings of the global carbon cycle by 10x, 10 times less. That's like hard to do. And you quickly come up upon different like silos where it's like, oh, like maybe the glaciologists who study glaciers in the Arctic and the ones who
mhm,
study glaciers in the Antarctic sometimes use different units for different things. And it's like, oh, like we need to make sure that these conversations are really happening across different parts of the kind of patchwork of understandings of different things, which means new connections, new ways to connect, and kind of, in a way, designing new interactions, I think.
mhm. Yeah. I'm pretty sure you are familiar with the work of Johan Rockström. He's this
Hmm.
climate scientist who, and he shows this beautiful presentation, and he's really good at communicating it. And also I'm always like waiting to hear his talk because I'm just he's gonna come up with new graph and new analysis or like compiling different papers, and I'm always like on the edge of my seat, like why is he gonna talk this time? And when I think about the IPCC report as well, like it's the same. Like I'm waiting every other year. Okay, like we're gonna get the report, and I can read the executive summary and dig into the papers. But there's a sense that this rhythm of publishing and the data review, um, and the way that we say, the scientists cannot say that we're in accelerating patterns of climate change because it's calculated on a 10 years average backwards. So in the 10 years, we could be in an anomaly and it goes down. So scientifically, they
Hmm.
cannot say that. But then the speed at which we're changing is accelerating. So
Hmm.
I'm wondering if in the philanthropic sector, if you're not beholden to this, you're still like, of course, like very high scientific standard, but you can be a bit more bold with your prediction, or you know, um, do you think that there's
Yeah.
a way to have like a faster refresh rate of making the simulation and projection in the future to actually help people?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think there's maybe two aspects to that. One of which is that the incentives tend to be a little bit different for or I think they're shifting in certain ways, and I think they should be shifting. I think that the kind of like academic model of like publish or perish, and then also publish and just be done, and like doesn't matter if people can't access your data or something like that, like whatever, you got the published paper. I think that that's getting more outdated, and that's a great thing, that there needs to be more attention to just different forms of impact, whatever way that might be, and more incentivizing of that. So philanthropy, I think, is a pretty unique position, one that I honestly want us to do more of, which is to, yeah, incentivize thinking about alternative methods to impact other than publishing, other than relating something to IPCC. Um, yeah, and the second aspect of that, I think, is that there are possibilities for new kind of understandings of approaches to modeling that I think that can offer us new forms of more rapid interactions with the data and with the systems. And I think that the promise of that is a more kind of instantaneous understanding of the dramatic impacts of different actions. Um, so there's kind of a dream there of like if you're on a national level setting climate goals, you're able to understand how your actions will influence the global carbon cycle in relation to the plan that India just launched last year, and in relation to the plan that Indonesia also just launched, and something like that. And having that kind of like interconnection of systems is really difficult. But that's where new kind of quicker modeling methods, basically, of sorts, like emulators, which take a really like vastly reduced parameter space, um, seem really promising and exciting to me.
And my last question is, a lot of people, they're working in climate. They were depressed before, and now they are not only depressed, they're also alarmed. So, so what are the things that sort of keep you hoping and keep like what gives you hope in the work that you do?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I really feel that. I think all the time it's like the mood can be quite somber. One thing I'll note is that I think a lot of it is grief, is like a feeling of grief for the planet. And I think that particularly in America, we're not very good at dealing with grief and mourning. So I think that having different ways to really embrace that feeling of like, this is awful and I feel a great loss, is a way to keep going in sometimes a surprising way. Um, and things that are giving me hope. I mean, one example is renewables, just like the increase in renewable projects and the fact that cost is going down substantially, feels really promising of like, okay, things pay off after a while. The issue then is that you immediately get back into the cycle of like, well, we don't have a while, like things are happening right now. Um, but I think, especially in relation to the kind of feeling of uncertainty around the current administration in America and movement to the right across governments that are kind of more antagonistic to climate goals, is like local resilience. I've been feeling that really like personally, just like here in New York City, I feel really much more like connected to local movements in strengthening the city. Um, and I think that there's still so much great work that's happening, and like people are resilient. Like people will find a way. And so when it looks the most bleak, I just think like, okay, like people are finding a way already, just like they have for centuries. So like we're gonna keep banding together, I guess.
Thank you so much, Carl Barnes, for spending some time with us and discussing those issues. We're really, really grateful. Um, Thank you.
Thank you.